on to our latest edition of the book club. My name is Michael Simonson. I'm here at the Leo Beck Institute, where I am an archivist. I'm the head of reference here, and I am also a director of public outreach here. And we have with us today a very special guest to help us discuss the book Heat and Dust by Ruth Prawer Jhabvala. Our guest is Fawzia Afzal-Khan. Fawzia is a professor of English, a university distinguished scholar, and former director of Women and Gender Studies at Montclair State University. She received her BA from Kinnaird College for Women in Lahore, Pakistan, and her MA and PhD in English literature from Tufts University. She is a cultural materialist who works at the intersection of feminist theory, cultural, performance, and postcolonial studies. She's a contributing editor to TDR, the Drama Review, and serves on the advisory board of SAR, the South Asian Review, and on the editorial board of Arab Stages. She is winner of a Fulbright Specialist Fellowship, 2015-2020. She's lectured at various universities in Pakistan with that. She's the author of 4 monographs and 2 edited anthologies. And finally, perhaps most interesting, well, not most interesting, but I think I find interesting, she's also a trained vocalist in the North Indian classical tradition. So Fawzia, I wanted to welcome you here with us today and thank you for doing this. And I am going to let you take over, and I will mute myself and disappear from the screen. And Fawzia, when you are done, just let me know. I'll come back on, and then we'll continue, and your presentation part is done. Okay,
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And, you know, if I'm going on too long, you just let me know and we'll stop. This is one of the hazards of, you know, the profession, right? We tend to go on and on. But I want to thank you, and I want to thank everybody else who has joined us today. Hello, everybody, and hope that I get to actually meet you and hear from you later on today. You know, when I was invited, Michael, by you to do this, I was a little hesitant because I'm not a Jhabvala scholar at all. I've written about her a little bit, and I'll hold this up. This was my first monograph. Can you all see it? Can you see this?
Yes, I think we can see it fine.
Okay, good. So cultural imperialism and the Indo-English novel, which was based on my dissertation. And I did mention a book, not Heat and Dust, actually another novel that Ruth Prawer Jhabvala wrote a little bit later called 3 Continents. You know, but I've read Heat and Dust, and I had the pleasure of rereading it in prep for today's discussion. So, you know, so I'm, you know, please do keep that in mind as I go through my slides here. For me, my interest in Jhabvala's work has been primarily through my sort of work and interest in what Michael also described in his introduction as a postcolonial studies scholar. So we look at literature, we look at culture in a very particular way through a particular lens. And that's not the only way, right, to look at a writer, to understand or to appreciate them. So that said, I just put together a bunch of slides here for you all to sort of follow along. And so, yeah, she lived you know, a nice long life. This is towards the end of her life. Well, not really. She still had a couple of good decades to go, but later in her life, a picture that I found, 1986, And actually, much like the Leo Baeck, Leo Baeck, you're all, most of you members of the Leo Baeck Institute. I think she's a complicated figure, right? From what little I know about Leo Baeck, and so her legacy is among literary aficionados and scholars also similarly complicated. So there are a couple of websites that are worth looking at if those of you who are interested in following her career a bit more in depth than maybe I'm able to present. But from there, so one of them is put together, one of these sites is a Jewish Women's Association site, and the other one, Ruth Prawer, Jhabvala.com, was provided by one of Jhabvala's daughters, and has been put together by one of her daughters, actually. And so from there, you can, we know that she was born in Cologne in Germany in 1927, and then the family, after the horrors of Kristallnacht, left, and, 1939, settled in England, where, some years later, her father did commit suicide once he found out that a lot of his family had been killed in the concentration camps. He really couldn't take it. So that is part of, her background. She did adjust, it seems, well to life in England, did well in school, ended up at Queen Anne College, and got a BA and a master's in English Lit there, and then met her husband, who was a Parsi architect from India, from Delhi, called Cyrus Jhabvala, and moved with him to Delhi, where she lived right up from 51 to 75, and then moved to New York City. And I think she went back and forth a little bit, and her husband would also visit. She raised her daughters basically in India, but then they're all, also settled here, I believe, and then lived in New York pretty much till 2013. Lots and lots of awards, recognized her both as a screenwriter for the James Ivory and Ismail Merchant Productions Company. I'm sure many of you have seen many of these films that she worked on. And she's one of the few writers who won actually both a Booker and an Oscar. And the Booker Prize was given for this novel that we're going to talk a little bit about today. Okay. You can all hear me, right? This is good, and you can see the slides. Are we good, Michael? So far?
So far, so good.
Okay, great. So now I just sort of moving on, let's, there is something about her background that she alludes to in 1979, shortly after winning the Booker, as she gives a lecture, she's picking up another prize, the Neil Gunn Fellowship, and she talks about her rootlessness, right? And how she felt about it. And she says here, I stand before you as a writer without any ground of being out of which to write, without any ground of being out of which to write, really blown about from country to country, culture to culture, till I am nothing. And yet, as Joshua Rothman in the New Yorker, writing about, commenting on this lecture of hers, says that she also mentions that many, or at least he sees that many of her stories are about an inner kind of travel, where feeling rootless, her protagonists find new ways to feel at home in the worlds that they happen to inhabit, which I think is a very interesting thought to keep in mind as we think about the various characters, who are mostly, the main protagonists who are British, two British women, right, separated by many years, but related to each other. Olivia and the nameless narrator, right, of the novel Heat and Dust, who in the film version is called Anne. So how this sort of might apply for us to sort of help us think about these characters. Now, I want to move on to this quote from Edward Said, who is said to be, many of us consider him to be a kind of a father of this field of postcolonial studies, right? And he wrote this important book. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with it, published in 1978, called Orientalism. And we can talk a little bit about this term Orientalism and, how it kind of helps us, or may help some, it may help us to also look at Jhabwala's work. He actually says in there something that is very interesting and in some ways is kin, it seems to me, to Jhabwala's experience as she just described it in the quote that I read about her rootlessness, which has to do obviously with her sense of disinheritance, right? From her culture, from her Jewish roots, from all of that she and her family had to leave behind when they moved to England. And what he says similarly, because he was a Palestinian who was exiled almost, at a very young age, they moved to, his family had to leave. In the wake of the creation of Israel, they moved to Lebanon, later to Egypt, and then he came to the States, and then he became, distinguished professor at Columbia University. But he says here, the more one is able to leave one's cultural home, the more easily is one able to judge it and the whole world as well with the spiritual detachment and generosity that is necessary for true vision. The more easily, too, does one assess oneself and alien cultures with the same combination of intimacy and distance. And so, this is something about this notion of intimacy, distance, vision, right? Detachment. We can think how these sort of epithets also might usefully be applied to Jhabwala's vision as we encounter it in her many different works, and certainly maybe particularly in Heat and Dust. So let's move on. Based off of that, I guess this is what I just said. But adding on to this, I think, and to complicate this notion of a generous vision, right, which is what we're getting, this may be a spiritual detachment and generosity and true vision. It sounds good, right? Positive, but you might give it a slightly not so positive spin when you ask, right, which I'm asking, is that can someone like Jhabwala's vision also, especially her vision of the other, right, the other to her own sense of a European self. She's often referred to as an Anglo-Indian writer because she was coming from England, and but that's a misnomer. Anglo-Indian is a term that really is understood to apply to people who were born as a result of the British colonial encounter with native Indians in India when the English, right, were occupying India after they colonized it. And many of their people married, men, right, married or had children with native women. And so Anglo-Indian is applied to the children of those unions of a British father and a, quote, native woman. So Ruth Prawer Jhabvala really should not be called or referred to as Anglo-Indian. She's not. She is English, right? An English woman in India. And so can her vision of the other, the Indian other, also, could we ask this question, also bear traces of a Western Orientalism that was also very much inherent or part and parcel of this vision of empire, right? And this is something that Said, obviously, that's what he meant by Orientalism, right? A style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction between the so-called Orient, right? And India would be considered the Orient, and the Occident, which is the West, which would be Europe, which would be England, right? And obviously also the New World, America, right? And it's this notion of this very radical or kind of differentiation, very distinct idea that there is a reality that is Eastern or Oriental versus a reality, a way of being and thinking in the world that is European. And once we set up, we in postcolonial studies like to think, we call this a sense of binary oppositions, right, that undergird our sense of the world in this way, then what results in terms of images and tropes in writing, in paintings, etc. And this has led to a rather long tradition of literature and art. We can think of painters, European French painters like Jerome Delacroix. We can think of, the Polish-British writer Conrad. We can think of the British Kipling in India, Forster, Paul Scott, and Jhabvala, all as sort of, to some degree, inhabiting that Orientalist, space. And that's something we can discuss, right? And what that means, all right? So moving on then, this is a quote from David Rubin, a scholar of Indian or Anglo-Indian Indo-English fiction, who I found when I was doing my research from that first book that I wrote. And it is called, his book, published in '86, which is really when I was doing my dissertation, was called After the Raj, British Novels of India Since 1947. And he writes, and I quote, "It is interesting to observe how powerful the old mythic patterns remain. And he's talking specifically of Ruth Prawer Jhabvala, because in so many stories in most of her novels, there is a basic structure that she employs in which individuals are somehow employed to dramatize the powerful and often destructive fascination of race, sex, and spirituality." Something that he calls this all-threatening Indian trinity, right? Whoops. That to him, right, reading that tradition of of writers who I had just mentioned in my previous slide, right? People like encompassing people from Conrad and Kipling all the way down at this moment to Jhabvala. He says that for a lot of them, this fascination with race, sex, and spirituality actually poses a threatening kind of Indian trinity that seems to dominate virtually all of what he's calling Anglo-Indian fiction, right? I mean, like I said, I think Anglo-Indian is a bit of a misnomer. I would say Anglo fiction about India. And this is interesting. And I agree with this to some degree, right? I do think that Jhabvala's writing, her stories, her fiction, her novels, they do debunk that myth, right? About this very threatening Indian trinity. But also, and I agree with him here as well, I think a lot of her work, including Heat and Dust, reinforces subtly many of its elements, which have to do with India as the site of destruction of the West and Western women, particularly evil Indian men, or just fatuous Indian men in the contemporary era, right? Often without any kind of, noble character, and they somehow are irresistible to a certain kind of European woman, right? And Olivia, right, in the novel represents that kind of woman. Now, turning to the novel itself, I had pulled up a few quotes that I thought were interesting, and we can see how different characters like Major Minnies, like Dr. Saunders, right, how they are sort of described, and they're not terribly sympathetically rendered. I think this is one of the ways in which Jhabvala is really quite critical of the British during the time of the British Raj, as it was called, right? And she, of course, is writing from hindsight because she's part of a post-independent India. and she's describing for us that time through Olivia, when she's visiting India as the wife of Douglas, right, who is one of the British reps there in the government. And now they all, however, these characters, these sort of white British men and women, all seem to think of Olivia after she sort of falls into love or in love with and runs off with the Nawab, that India, so the Nawab becomes all of India, and India seeks out women like her, right, where she's weakest, and pulls them over into this other dimension. So here we go with that sense of India as the other, right? Something that threatens the good, virtuous, upright white woman who is seen and claimed as property by her own men also, right? Her own people, because now she's gone over there to the other side. And this, of course, threatens discord. And what I'm arguing, and I think it's worth looking at, is that Conrad, going back to Conrad, right? If any of you have read Heart of Darkness, we see how he describes the character of Kurtz gets lost in a very similar way as Olivia does in this novel, right? Because Conrad's character Kurtz, who is supposedly this enlightened, rational, brilliant, wonderful representor of Britain, of Belgium, goes into the, quote, Belgian Congo and is eaten up, made or rendered savage by the darkness of the African continent into which he has stepped and which he has in a way embraced, right? And because he too, like Olivia in this novel, is critical of, in his case, Belgian imperialism. Olivia, is critical of British imperial attitudes, but their critique ends up making them weak. And that is really what this novel, Heat and Dust, is laying out for us, because Olivia does not end up well. There are echoes of Forster's Passage to India as well. And, I was just talking to Michael a little while ago and said that I think Forster, in some ways, reenacts or reuses Orientalist tropes, especially the trope of India is a muddle rather than a mystery, right? I mean, everything about India is a muddle. I mean, it's not very flattering to India or Indians because mystery, at least you can, try to, it's sophisticated. A muddle is just a muddle. And also, he uses another trope in his novel of Passage to India, where the white woman, the British woman, sort of imagines in the case of his novel that she is being completely, she's being raped by an Indian man. Now, to his credit, and also to Jhabvala's credit, I mean, they don't go along with those tropes, right? They criticize that kind of British stereotyping of the other, particularly the other man, the brown man in this case, the Indian man, as being interested only in sort of raping and bedding white women, okay? But the problem is that, in fact, what does happen in these novels, and here I'm talking, what happens is that it turns out to be true at some level, right? This desire of Indian men, if not to rape, but certainly to bed European, in this case, specifically British white women, as a way to get back at, right? And insult, in a way, right? The British men, because it's the British men who have taken over their country and in a way infantilized and feminized the Indian men, like the Nawab, for example, in the story. And when we meet the granddaughter of, or the great-granddaughter, I think, right, of Olivia, granddaughter of Olivia, when she comes out, right, to India many decades after Olivia's story is finished and Olivia and the Nawab are dead, the British have left, when this young woman comes out to trace her ancestors' footsteps and to find out more about her story, she does not meet the glamorous India that once was. And she also falls, like Olivia had fallen in love with the Nawab. She sort of falls, if not in love, certainly has sex with and quite likes her Indian landlord, who's hardly a Nawab. He's this sort of poor, lower middle class guy. And so he can't be credited with the kind of sort of maybe evil intentions that the Nawab has. But yeah, I mean, he's not leaving his wife. He's interested in her to the degree that she's an available white woman, right? So that trope of this brown man who is oversexed, who is also only interested in betting the white woman in a way to sort of assert his masculinity and give the middle finger to the British, that kind of trope plays out again and again in all of these novels. So I wanted to just point that out. There is also this troubling reference to sati. I don't know, Michael, how are we doing on time? Because I don't want to take up too much.
We are doing okay. I think we can go maybe 10 more minutes.
Okay. All right, cool.
That's fine.
So, and now sati, again, something that has been made much of in the West, right? This, like, for example, when we think of China, the image, when we think of Chinese women, what comes up in our heads? And this is all part of that Orientalist framing of knowledge, right? That Said had referred to, which is, in the case of Chinese women, foot binding, right? Oh my God, so terrible. The poor Chinese women are victims of these terrible customs. And then in the case of India, right, we've got this issue of sati, which titillates even as it draws our, feelings of horror to the surface about this, the barbarism of India, right, and of the uncivilized other. And there is a reference to sati fairly early on in the novel. And you see, this is the problem. And this is part of what I would call a kind of Orientalist framing of the issue. Even when clearly Jhabvala is neither, she's neither siding with the practice of sati, that would be awful, right? But through her character of Olivia, she's also introducing this element of, well, we can't really interfere, as Olivia says, in their customs. After all, it's their culture, which is bizarre. Cultures are not this, fixed. Sati was never something that went uncriticized by Native women themselves, when some of them did go along with the custom. And this is part of the discussion that happens in the novel, right, between different characters. A lot of them, right, they don't willingly, these women don't, when they go willingly onto their husband's funeral pyres, they're not doing it out of what, as Olivia says, because they're so madly in love with their husbands, they can't imagine life without him after he's dead. And so they just want to burn themselves by jumping on his funeral pyre. This is quite ridiculous. And a lot of these women, when they did do that, and many of them did go, quote unquote, willingly, that willingly has to be interpreted, right? It's there often because the local Hindu patriarchal system, and especially upper caste system, dictated that if these women did not go and burn themselves along with their husbands when their husbands died, and just, they would be very, very poorly treated in their lives. They would be sent off to these horrible widow spaces. They would get no share of any of the property. It was that kind of a thing, right? Which was not touched by the British. You see, so when the British come here, and in this case, they claim through Dr. Saunders and Major Minnies, right? Oh, well, we have gone in and we have banned this, practice. It makes them look good, like they're bringing civilization to these darkies. But the fact is, this was a show and tell kind of a thing, right? Because the actual structural problems that led a lot of women to continue in this practice were never tackled, because British men were in cahoots with a lot of the native patriarchs, because without their cooperation, right, they couldn't really rule. So these kinds of things are complicated, but they're not presented in these complicated ways. They're presented to score points, right? Because this is, after all, a novel and not a scholarly book. But in presenting it in this simplistic way, where Olivia is taking the side of the Sati woman, and the others are criticizing it, I mean, it creates, a very simplistic for and against scenario, which is not helpful and is actually fairly Orientalist. And then, of course, we have Olivia running at the end after she commits, she decides to go for an abortion. She runs for the Nawab's palace from the hospital, where, of course, she is found out by Dr. Saunders that she has indeed had an abortion, and it's not just a miscarriage, because, he knows what native abortions look like. He's disgusted by her. And meanwhile, she runs away to run, goes to the, instead of running back to her husband, she knows that she won't be forgiven. She goes to the Nawab. And this is very interesting. I thought you might be interested, that we are told that she was wearing a servant's corsari. And so she reminded Harry, who is this other very interesting character, a British man who has been living in the Nawab's palace and has obviously a very close, very intimate relationship with the Nawab, but is in a kind of a love-hate relationship almost, right? He loves India. He hates the fatuousness of the British, but he's extremely British, and he also is dying to get out from under the grip of the Nawab, who won't let him leave. So the Nawab does not come off well at all. And so you have to wonder what is wrong with this woman, Olivia, that she has fallen so head over heels with this man who is painted in quite dark colors. And so this Harry is the one who is now telling Olivia's relative, her granddaughter, that when Olivia left, when she ran and got to the palace, and Harry actually met her, she reminded him of a print he had seen called Mrs. Seccombe in Flight from the Mutineers. Mrs. Seccombe was also in native dress in that portrait, right? And in a great state of agitation, with her hair awry and smears of dirt on her face. Naturally, since she was flying for her life from the mutineers at Sikrora to the safety of the British residency of Lucknow, she would be in a great state of agitation, because she's worried she's going to be raped and, or worse, killed by the mutineers, right? They are referred to as the mutineers, but in Indian historiography, the mutineers are referred to as Indian independence fighters, right? Because they were fighting for the independence of India from British rule. Of course, from the British point of view, they are mutineers. And here, Harry remarks that Olivia was also in flight, but in the opposite direction, right? So you have to wonder, right? This is one of the famous paintings, Flight from Lucknow, and you see the poor, frightened, blonde, obviously white woman dressed in native dress. She's being held by another woman of her kind, and there is this ayah, some nanny, holding the blonde daughter, and they're fleeing. These are all people in flight from, this background, which is very dark, right? Which represents the Indian, quote unquote, mutineers. So Olivia fleeing in the opposite direction, you have to question her judgment, no? And of course, we have to question the Nawab's motives, all the stories he tells about, how one of his ancestors, killed, trapped, a whole party of guests and ran daggers through them because he was displeased with his behavior. This is meant to instill fright into his audience, right? And which at this point includes Olivia. And Olivia tries to get her hand away from him, but he won't let her go. And then after she becomes pregnant and tells him she's pregnant, with, he assumes it's their child. And this is what he says: wait till my son, again, the male, right? Assuming it's going to be a boy, wait till my son is born. He said, then they'll laugh from the other side of their mouths, right? So clearly he is going to use the birth of what he assumes will be a boy from Olivia to rub dirt in the face of the British, who have reduced him and his kingdom to Khatam, right? It's called even the kingdom of Khatam, right? His Nawabdom is called Khatam, which in Urdu and in Hindi, Khatam means the end. The word actually translates as the end. So he is definitely the end of his generation, of generations of rulers, Muslim and Hindu of India, because the British have seen, they've seen to that, right? That this is the end. And of course, on the other side, her husband doesn't come off very well either, because he is now crowing that when his son is born, assuming, and he also assumes, he doesn't know anything about her affair with, what's his name, the Nawab. And so he says, oh, but assuming again, it will be a son. And then he will get, the christening gowns will be brought in. I think his sister has them somewhere. And the christening gowns, baby gown, consists of cascades of white lace, very becoming to the Rivers babies, who are all very, very fair. They all have white, blonde hair. So once again, this contrast between the British self, which is white and blonde, and representative of sort of what the British think that they're doing in India, which is bringing the light of civilization, the white light of civilization, to these barbaric, dark other Indians, right? And neither comes off very well. And this is where I see that I think Jhabvala does criticize both sides, right? She's not an Orientalist to the degree where only the Indians are seen as, kind of unredeemable. But there are other tropes, very troubling, like the evil Begum, the mother of the Nawab, right? We are told, oh, you don't know what goes on in there, because she is the mother, is the one who is with great glee and interest. She helps Olivia go through a native style abortion, which is, obviously quite dangerous. And we are told she is right there, and she's hardly empathetic to Olivia's plight, and she does not want her to have a child who she also assumes might belong to her son. So there's this sense of east is east, west is west, never the twain shall meet, which of course goes back all the way to Rudyard Kipling, right? And again, feeds into the Orientalist trope. And then we hear another story about, how I think the father of the current Nawab had a mistress who was from Yorkshire. And when he died, that woman had to run, even though she was a tough little character from Yorkshire. She wasn't tough enough to withstand this evil Begum, right, who makes sure that this poor young British girl is so frightened, she runs literally in her nightdress, kind of like this vision, right? Away from, in less salubrious, better clothing, right? Than even this woman in the painting. She runs to the British, right? Because she says, they're going to poison me otherwise, because now my protector is dead, and his mother is surely going to put poison clothes on me like they did on somebody else, and I will be dead. I'm not going to really read this because I think we're running out of time, but I did want to again refer back to this novel, Three Continents, which is much later than, almost a decade later than, written and published a decade later than Heat and Dust. And in which the young couple at the center of it are twins, teenage twins, Harriet and Michael. And they are, I mean, they fall prey to, they are so naive, they're Americans, so in some ways they're worse than the British, right, in terms of their naivete. And they fall prey to this Krishi character, who is like this yogi character who cheats them out of all of their money. And again, the female, the woman, Harriet, falls for him so badly that she loses all sense and sensibility. She loses her powers of reason. A brother dies, and she ends up totally under the thumb of this man, and ends up making over the entire fortune that they had inherited from their parents over to this very, very no good character, right? Towards the end, the Nawab, to go back to Heat and Dust, becomes a glutton, right? Another, I would say, Orientalist trope. He becomes fat and ridiculous. And Harry is very grateful that he's living with his, more suitable partner in London, who is also British, and says these things that are not at all, they're not meant to be in any kind of praise of the man that he lived with, the Nawab, for such a long time in India. I mean, he criticizes him and tells, the narrator, oh my God, the Nawab had gotten so fat, and he had gotten so fat that he also broke two of my dining room chairs just by sitting on them. So it's partly humorous, right? But the Nawab just goes from being at least having a slightly dashing personality to being reduced to a fat glutton who is really unattractive. And furthermore, really, we see how he's unmusical. And in fact, Harry comes into his own because he is now able to really say what he truly feels about the Nawab. He's no longer, quote, under his thumb living in his palace. Why he lives there so long, we can only guess. But certainly it's because both he and Olivia somehow come under the spell of this Indian man who is, maybe in cahoots with dacoits. I mean, he's just a no good character. The Begum, his mother, is accused of having purloined the state jewels of Khatam. So, I mean, both mother and son are, problematic characters, right? So yes, I've already said this. Harry, in retrospect, does come to detest India. And we hear that his delicate digestive system never recovers from having lived in India. We see this also in the modern version, right? And a section where Chid is this character, that the unnamed narrator of the novel, who is now named Anne. She meets him, and he's pathetic, and certainly his digestive system really suffers, and in the end he has to leave India, right? And so my question here was, do these characters, Indian and Western in India of the 1970s, fare any differently or better than Olivia and the colonialist Brits and the Nawab and his retinue of the 1920s? Because the novel moves back and forth between these two time frames, right? What has changed? What is still the same? And so for me, nothing has changed other than the fact that India post-independence has gotten dirtier and more corrupt and less attractive all around. I mean, the state of the latrines made, Anne sick in the film, right? I'm sorry, yeah, in the novel, the narrator says, the state of the latrines made me sick. And so on and so forth. So we'll end up here. This is my last couple of slides, but I don't think we're going to have time to run the trailer. I did put that in, but I wanted to mention, this tradition of Europeans, of British, of writing about India. Carries on, right? And one of the more well-known ones today is William Dalrymple. Many of you probably have heard of him. And it's very interesting. He actually traces a very different history of the Anglo-Indian encounter from a lot of who I've just described as following this Orientalist trajectory. He describes that. I mean, I'm going to leave this up. I'm not going to take up time going into that. But he, for example, discovered very interestingly, this maybe I'll read. He was, when he began research on the British for his novel, one of his novels, he was surprised to find that he too had Indian blood. So he probably was Anglo-Indian, right? If his father was Indian and he had, or one of his ancestors was Indian who was married to or had children with a local Indian woman, then he would have had Indian, and then that would have led to Dalrymple tracing his Indianness to them, then that would make him Anglo-Indian. And he says, very interesting, no one in my family, of course, had seemed to know about this history, though it should not have been a surprise because we had all heard the stories of how our beautiful dark-eyed Calcutta-born great-great-grandmother, Sophia Pattle, with whom the painter Sir Edward Burne-Jones had fallen in love, was somebody who lived in India and was presumably the person that had children with her progeny had children with dark-skinned Indians, right? And then here, so he talks about a lot of sort of this mixture of the British. It was not so standoffish and so defined, that line of difference, right? As a lot of the Orientalist novels make us think that the British were on this side and then the Indians were on this side. And in a way, in the novel Heat and Dust in the 1970s, the woman who's narrating, the progeny of Olivia and Douglas, I mean, she does exemplify maybe a hope for a new kind of encounter, right? Because she does choose to have the child that is a child of her liaison with an Indian man. And she decides to stay on in India, goes up to the mountains, to the place where Olivia had lived out, the last years of her life. But she does that with, I think, a lot more agency than Olivia did. And so there may be that sense that something has shifted for the better. I don't know. I can't make up my mind. And I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Please like and subscribe to receive more content from the Leo Baeck Institute.